political analysis that we can say if a political power is legitimate or illegitimate. What is that is basically depend on our understanding and differentiating between psychological definition of anxiety and the political definition of it. The political anxiety has been always accompanied by the fear of preservation, and it is more tangible within the behavior of authorities, and by fear of individual from the structure of violence. Why an authority should have political anxiety? Well, the simple answer to that is due to the nature of political power, an ongoing rivalry of justification for legitimacy or ongoing struggle of preservation for authoritative political power is the main cause of political anxiety. So we can merge this idea with different power structure and the power itself. De facto political power is considered always with a high level of political consciousness. Look at these two bar charts. The gray color is representing non-authoritative regime and the red one is representing authoritative regimes. Now imagine there is a high level of political consciousness in authoritative regimes. Then there would be a high level of anxiety in the power relations. Self-consciousness of political power and of its illegitimacy simultaneously produce a high level of anxiety for the sake of its own preservation. Then they use power out of the border of rational normative legitimacy. Human rights and equality would be not important. The practice of political power under the anxiety is a legitimate act of aggression. Here, we can see that in authoritative regimes, the political consciousness and political anxiety have an equal ratio. That is why they use high level of oppression. In contrary, a high level of political consciousness is component of democratic regimes. It is not threat to them. So, there is a low level of anxiety and a low level of aggression. Thus, in democratic regime or non-authoritative regimes, the political consciousness and political anxiety have opposite ratio. In this sense, there is a direct link between political consciousness, political anxiety, and political power. Now let us take a quick look at the lower chart. Accordingly, when there is a high level of political consciousness, a high level of oppression, the consent of people to such power structure would be pretty low. Now, without the consent or belief of the citizens, a legitimate political power has no other instrument to be preserved other than a legitimate act of aggression. Here, both anxiety and frustration rooted in political preservation. Now, I can clearly say that the frustration-aggression hypothesis would be partially worked, but it is not sufficient. In a political-oriented aspect, I have a substitute concept of anxiety-aggression hypothesis. So the illegitimate state have a high level of anxiety and the use of illegitimate act of aggression as their instrument for all purposes. But what the authoritative state do is to use the illegitimate act of aggression to justify the political power. In other words, what these authoritative regimes do is to force their subjects to their justification of power. They are violating the rights of their citizens and oppressing their subjects every day. The claim to the legitimacy through the oppressive-oriented justification is a pure oppression and negated based on political consciousness theory. This is what I call as fallacy of legitimization. They use the fallacy of legitimization to justify the regime, so they violate human rights. In a big picture, there are three forms of violation. Direct act of violation like murder, injuries, and war. indirect act of violation, like discrimination, violation of liberty. More complex is the combination of direct and indirect violation, such as all oppressive regimes, or even terrorist groups such as ISIL are representative of such form. The trend against the fallacy of legitimization and any illegitimate act of aggression is legitimate act of aggression. It is aggression since it is the act of correction, and it is legitimate because it is against the fallacy of legitimization. It is backed up with a rational normative ground, and in most of the cases, it is accompanied with collective consent. Aim of a legitimate act of aggression is applying a minimum level of justice in a world which is based on rational normative principle, preserving human rights and dignity, and to establish and securing peace. Now, what about ISIL, the Ebola of people? ISIL as a terrorist group finds its foothold in some part of Iraq, Syria, and Africa. Its existence and practice of power is illegitimate, and its counterattack would be a legitimate act of aggression. As Pope Francis said, stopping the unjust aggressor is legitimate. One important and final point is that the direct and indirect legitimate act of aggression against act of oppression can be appealed through ratification of law and regulating economic policies both within a nation, but mostly more effective when it is applied by international authorities. The effectiveness of direct and indirect act of aggression should be based on its hegemonic consensus, collective democratic values, and political consciousness basis, which manifests itself in the actualization of capacity for justice and international norms such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, at the end, I would like to express a wish, and that is I hope one day, by working together, we won't anymore need to analyze such subjects, and we live in a pure, secure, peaceful world. That if there is any act of aggression, only be legitimate and be at the lowest level. Thank you all for your attention.